read chapter 63 and 64, and then I'm gonna do a specific video, special video, letting you guys know the next book I'll be reading. And yes, these are Christmas decorations. I don't celebrate Halloween, so I decorate the house Christmas. So, yes, my Christmas tree is already up. Let's get started. Okay, chapter 60, Rebellion. Sometimes I don't know how people live many miles apart seem to realize the time has come to act. Perhaps ideas can spread like pollen on the breeze. In any case, down in the palace dungeons, the prisoners owed hidden knives and chisels, heavy saucepans, and rolling pins beneath their mattresses, and stones in their cell walls were ready at last. At dawn on the day the Ickabog approached Kurtzburg, Captain Goodfellow and Mr. Dovetail, whose cells were opposite each other, were awake, pale, tense, and sitting on the edges of their beds, because today was the day they vowed to escape or die. Several floors above the prisoners, Lord Spittleworth too woke early, completely unaware that the prisoner break was brewing beneath his feet, or that a real live Ickabog was at the very moment advancing on Joseville, surrounded by an ever-growing crowd of cornucopians. Spittleworth washed, dressed in his chief's advisor robes, then headed out to locked wing of the stables, which had been under guard for a week. Stand aside, Spittleworth told the soldiers on guard, and he unbolted the doors. A team of exhausted seamstresses and tailors were waiting beside the model of a monster inside the stable. It was the size of a bull, with leathery skin, and was covered in spikes. Its carved feet bore fearsome claws, its mouth was full of fangs, and its angry eyes glowed amber in its face. The seamstresses and the tailors watched fearfully as Spittleworth walked slowly around their creation. Close up, you could see the stitching, tell that their eyes were made of glass, that the spikes were really nails pushed through the leather, and that the claws and fangs were nothing but painted wood. If you prodded the beast and trickled the sawdust ran from the seams. Nevertheless, by the dim light of the stables, it was a convincing piece of work that the seamstresses and tailors were thankful to see Spittleworth smile. "It will do, by candlelight at least," he said. "I'll simply have to make the dear king stand well back as he looks at it. We can say the spikes and fangs are still poisonous." The workers exchanged relieved looks. They've been working all day and all night for a week. Now at last they've been able to go home to their families. "Soldiers," said Spittleworth, turning to the guards waiting the country yard, "take these people away. If you scream," he added lazily, as a youngest seamstress opened the mouth to do so, "you'll be shot." While her team that had made the stuffed Ickabog was dragged away by the soldiers, Spittleworth went upstairs whistling to the king's apartment. where he found Fred wearing silk pajamas and a hairnet over his mustache, and Flapoon tucking a napkin beneath his chin. Oh, his many chins. "Good morning, Your Majesty," said Spittleworth with a bow. "I trust you slept well. I have a surprise for you, Your Majesty, today. We have succeeded in having the Ickabog stuffed. I know Your Majesty was eager to see it." "Wonderful, Spittleworth," said the king, "and after that we might send it around the kingdom." "What?" "To show the people what we're up against." "I would advise against that, sire," said Spittleworth, who feared that if anybody saw the stuffed Ickabog by daylight, they'd be sure to spot it was a fake. He wouldn't want the common folk to panic. Your Majesty is so brave that you can cope with that sight." At the moment, the doors to the king's private apartments flew open, and it ran in the wild-eyed, sweaty Basher John, who'd been delayed on the road by not one but two sets of highwaymen after getting lost in some woods, the falling off of his horse while jumping a ditch, then being unable to catch it again. Basher John hadn't managed to reach the palace much ahead of the Ickabog. Panicking, he'd forced entry to the palace through the scullery window, and the two guards had pursued him through the palace, both of them prepared to run him through with their swords. Fred let out a scream and hid behind Flapoon. Spittleworth pulled out his dagger and jumped to his feet. "There's an Ickabog," panted Basher John, falling to his knees. "A real, live Ickabog. It's coming here. With thousands of people, the Ickabog is real." Naturally, Spittleworth didn't believe this story for a second. "Take him to the dungeons," he snarled at the guards, who dragged the struggling Basher John from the room and closed the doors again. "I do apologize, sire," said Spittleworth, who was still holding his dagger. "The man will be horsewhipped, and so will the guards who let him break into the palace." But before Spittleworth could finish his sentence, two more men came bursting into the king's private apartments. These were Spittleworth and Shosville's spies, who had had word from the north about the Ickabog's approach. But as the king had never laid eyes on them before, he let out another terrified squeal. "My lord," panted the first spy, bowing to Spittleworth, "there's an Ickabog coming this way, and it's got a crowd with it," panted the second. "It's real." "Well, of course the Ickabog's real," said Spittleworth, who could hardly say anything else with the king present. "Notify the Ickabog Defense Brigade. I shall join them shortly in the courtyard, and we'll kill the beast." Spittleworth ushered the spies to the door and thrust them back into the passageway, drawing down out their whispers of, "My lord, it's real, and the people like it, and it is on its way south. My lord, our contacts seen it with their two eyes. We shall kill this monster as we've killed the others," said Spittleworth loudly for the king's benefits, and then under his breath he added, "Go away." Spittleworth closed the door firmly on the spies and returned to the stable, disturbed, but trying not to show it. Flapoon was still tucking into some Barrowstone ham. He had a vague idea that Spittleworth must be behind all these people rushing in and talking about live Ickabogs, so he wasn't frightened in the slightest. Fred, on the other hand, was quivering from head to toe. "Imagine the monster showing itself in daylight," Spittleworth, he whimpered. "I thought it only ever came out at night." "Yes, it's getting far too bold, isn't it, Your Majesty?" said Spittleworth. He had no idea what this so-called real Ickabog could be. The only thing he could imagine was that some common folk had rigged up some kind of fake monster, possibly to steal food or force gold out of their neighbors, but it would still have to be stopped, of course. There was only one true Ickabog, and that was the one Spittleworth had invented. "Come, Flapoon, we must prevent this beast from entering Jokesville." "You're so brave, Spittleworth," said King Fred in a broken voice. "Tish pish, Your Majesty," said Spittleworth. "I would lay down my life for cornucopia. You should know that by now." Spittleworth's hand was on the door handle when yet more running footsteps, this time accompanied by shouting and clanking, shattered it to pieces. Startled, Spittleworth opened the door to see what was going on. A group of ragged prisoners was running toward him. At the head was the white-haired Mr. Dovetail, who held an axe, but in burly Captain Goodfellow, who carried a gun, clearly wrestled from the hands of the palace guard. Right behind them came Mrs. Beamish, her hair flying behind her as she brandished an enormous saucepan, and hot on her heels came Millicent, Lady Islanda's maid, who held a rolling pin. Just in time, Spittleworth slammed and bolted the door. Within seconds, Mr. Dovetail's axe had smashed through the wood. "Flapoon, come!" shouted Spittleworth, and the two lords ran across the room to another door, which led to a staircase down to the courtyard. Fred, who had no idea what was going on, who'd never even realized that there were 50 people trapped in the dungeons of his palace, was slow to react. Seeing the faces of the furious prisoners appeared at the hole Mr. Dovetail had hacked in the door, he jumped up to follow the two lords, but they, interested only in their own skins, had bolted the door. They had escaped through from the other side. King Fred was left standing in his pajamas with his back to the wall, watching the escaped prisoners hack their way into his room. Chapter 61. Flapoon fires again. The two lords dashed out into the palace courtyard to find the Ickabog Defense Brigade, also mounted and armed as Spittleworth had ordered. However, Major Broad, the man who'd kidnapped Daisy years before, who'd been promoted after Spittleworth shot Major Roach, was looking nervous. "My lord," he said to Spittleworth, who was hastily mounting his horse, "there's something happening inside the palace. We heard an uproar." "Never mind that now," snapped Spittleworth. A sound of shattering glass made all the soldiers look up. "There are people in the king's bedroom," cried Broad. "Shouldn't we help him?" "Forget the king," shouted Spittleworth. Captain Goodfellow now appeared at the king's bedroom window. Looking down, he bellowed, "You won't escape." Spittleworth. "Oh, won't I?" snarled the lord, and kicking his thin yellow horse, he forced it into a gallop and disappeared out of the palace gates. Major Broad was too scared of Spittleworth not to follow, so he and the rest of the Ickabog Defense Brigade charged after his lordship, all along with Flapoon, who had barely managed to get onto his horse before Spittleworth set off, bouncing along at the rear, holding on to his horse mane for dear life and trying to find his stirrups. Some men might have considered themselves beaten, what with escaped prisoners taking over the palace and fake Ickabogs marching through the country and attracting crowds, but not Lord Spittleworth. He still had a squad of well-trained, well-armed soldiers riding behind him, heaps of gold hidden at his mansion in the country, and his crafty brain was already devising a plan. Firstly, he'd shoot the men who'd faked this Ickabog and terrify the people back into obedience. Then he'd send Major Broad and his soldiers back to the palace to kill all the escaped prisoners. Of course, the prisoners might have killed the king by that time, but in truth, it might be easier to govern the country without Fred. As he galloped along, Spittleworth thought bitterly that if only he hadn't had to put so much effort into lying to the king, he might not have made certain mistakes, like letting that wretched pastry chef have knives and saucepans. He also regretted not hiring more spies, because then he might have found out that someone was making a fake Ickabog. A fake, by the sound of it, that was far more convincing than the one he'd seen that morning in the stables. So the Ickabog Defense Brigade charged through the surprisingly empty cobble streets of Showsville and out onto the open road that led to Kurtburg. To Spittleworth Furry, he now saw why the Showsville streets had been empty, having heard the rumor that an actual Ickabog was walking toward the capital. With a large crowd, the citizens of Showsville had hurried out to catch a glimpse of it with their own eyes. "Out of your way, out of our way," screamed Spittleworth, scattering the common people before him, furious to see them looking excited rather than scared. He spurred his horse onward until his sides were bleeding. Lord Flapoon followed, now green in the face because he hadn't had time to digest his breakfast. At last, Spittleworth and the soldiers spotted a huge crowd advancing in the distance, and Spittleworth hauled at his poor horse reins so that it skidded to a halt in the road. There, in the midst of the thousands of laughing and singing cornucopians, was a giant creature as tall as two horses, with eyes glowing like lamps, covered in long greenish-brown hair like marsh weed. On its shoulders rode a young woman, and in front of it marched two young men holding up wooden signs. Every now and then the monster stooped down, and yes, it seemed to be handing out flowers. "It's a trick," muttered Spittleworth, so shocked and scared he hardly knew what he was saying. "It must be a trick," he said more loudly, craning his scrawny neck to try to see how it was done. "There are obviously people standing on each other's shoulders inside the suit of the marshweed, guns at the ready, men." But the soldiers were slow to obey. In all the time they'd been supposedly protecting the country from the Ickabog, the soldiers had never seen it, nor had they really expected to. Yet they weren't at all convinced they were watching a trick. On the contrary, the creature looked very real to them. It was patting dogs on their head and handing out flowers to children and letting the girls sit on his shoulders. It didn't seem fierce at all. The soldiers were also scared of the crowd of thousands marching along with the Ickabog, who all seemed to like it. What would they do if the Ickabog was attacked? Though one of the youngest soldiers lost his head completely. "That's not a trick, I'm off." Before anybody could stop him, he galloped away. Flapoon, who had at last found his stirrups, now rode up front to take its place beside Spittleworth. "What do we do?" asked Flapoon, watching the Ickabog and the joyful singing crowd drawing near and near. "I'm thinking," snarled Spittleworth. "I'm thinking." But the cogs of Spittleworth's busy brain seemed to have jammed at last. It was a joyful face that upset him most. He'd come to think of laughter as a luxury like Joseville pastries and silk sheets, and seeing these ragged people having fun frightened him more than if they'd all been carrying guns. "I'll shoot it," said Flapoon, raising his gun and taking aim at the Ickabog. "No," said Spittleworth. "Look, man, can't you see we're outnumbered?" But at the precise moment, the Ickabog let out a deafening, blood-curdling scream. The crowd that had pressed around it backed away, their faces suddenly scared. Many dropped their flowers, some broke into a run. With another terrible screech, the Ickabog fell to its knees, almost shaking Daisy loose, though she clung on tightly. And then the huge dark split appeared down the Ickabog's enormous swollen belly. You were right, Spittleworth, bellowed Flapoon, raising his blunderbuss. There are men hiding inside it. And as the people in the crowd began to scream and flee, Lord Flapoon took aim at the Ickabog's belly and fired. Chapter 62, The Boarding. And now several things happened at almost the same time, so nobody watching could possibly keep up, but luckily I can tell you about all of them. Lord Flapoon's bullet went flying toward the Ickabog's opening belly. Both Bert and Roderick could have sworn to protect the Ickabog, no matter what flung themselves into the path of the bullet, which hit Bert squarely in the chest. As he fell to the ground, his wooden sign bearing the message "The Ickabog is harmless" shattered into splinters. Then a baby Ickabog, which was already taller than a horse, came struggling out of its Icker's belly. Its boarding had been a dreadful one, because it had come into the world full of its parents' fear of the gun, and the first thing it had ever seen was an attempt to kill it. So it sprinted straight at Flapoon, who was trying to reload. The soldiers who might have helped Flapoon were so terrified of the new monster bearing down upon them that they galloped out of its path without ever trying to fire. Spittleworth was one of those who rode away fastest, and he was soon lost to sight. The baby Ickabog let out a terrible roar that still haunts the nightmares of those who witnessed the scene before launching itself at Flapoon. Within seconds, Flapoon lay dead upon the ground. All of this had happened very fast. People were screaming and crying, and Daisy was still holding on to the dying Ickabog, which lay in the road beside Bert. Roderick and Martha were bending over Bert, who, to their amazement, had opened his eyes. I think I'm all right, he whispered, and feeling beneath his shirt, he pulled out his father's huge silver medal. Flapoon's bullet was buried in it. The medal had saved Bert's life. Seeing that Bert was alive, Daisy now buried her hands in the hair on either side of the Ickabog's face again. I didn't see the Ickabog, whispered the dying Ickabog, in those whose eyes were again tears like glass apples. It's beautiful, said Daisy, who was also starting to cry. Look, here, a second Ickabog was wriggling out of the Ickabog's tummy. This one had a friendly face and wore a timid smile because its boarding had happened, and its parent was looking into Daisy's face and had seen her tears and understood that a human could love an Ickabog as though it was one of their own family. Ignoring the noise and clamor all around it, the second Ickabog knelt beside Daisy in the road and stroked the big Ickabog's face. Icker and Ickabog looked at each other and smiled, and then the big Ickabog's eyes gently closed, and Daisy knew that it was dead. She buried her face in its shaggy hair and sobbed. You mustn't be sad, said a familiar booming voice as something stroked her hair. Don't cry, Daisy. This is the boarding. It is a glorious thing. Blinking, Daisy looked up at the baby, which was speaking with exactly the voice of its Icker. You know my name, she said. Well, of course I do, said the Ickabog kindly. I was born dead, knowing all about you, and now we must find my Ickabog, which Daisy understood as the Ickabogs called their siblings. Daisy stood up and saw Flapoon lying dead in the road, and the firstborn Ickabog, surrounded by the people holding pitchforks and guns. Climb up here with me, said Daisy urgently to the second baby, and hand in hand the two of them mounted the wagon. Daisy shouted at the crowd to listen, as she was the girl who'd ridden through the country on the shoulders of the Ickabog. The nearest people guessed that she might know things worth hearing, so they shushed everyone else, and at last Daisy was able to speak. "You mustn't hurt the Ickabogs," were the first words out of her mouth. When at last the crowd was silent, if you're cruel to them, they'll have babies who are born even crueler." "Born it cruel," corrected the Ickabog beside her. "Born it cruel, yes," said Daisy. "But if they're born it in kindness, they will be kind. They eat only mushrooms and they want to be our friends." The crowd muttered, uncertain, until Daisy explained about Major Beamish's death on the marsh and how he'd been shot by the Lord's baboon, not killed by an Ickabog, and that Spittleworth had used the death to invent a story of a murderous monster on the marsh. Then the crowd decided that they wanted to go and talk to King Fred. So the bodies of the dead Ickabog and the Lord Flaboon were loaded onto the wagon. The 20 strong men pulled it along. Then the whole procession set off for the palace, with Daisy, Martha, and the kind Ickabog arm in arm at the front, and the 30 citizens with guns surrounding the fierce firstborn Ickabog, which otherwise would have killed more humans because it had been born in fearing and hating them. But after a quick discussion, Bert and Roderick vanished, and where they went, you'll find out soon. Okay, guys, we're down now to the last 2 chapters. So, thank you so much for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe, give me a thumbs up, share, comment, follow me on Instagram, and I will be talking to you and seeing you in my next video.